Great. Thank you, Laura. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, colleagues, friends. Welcome to this second webinar organized by the Environment Management Group on the issue of repurposing subsidies. You may know that the Environment Management Group is an interagency group of the United Nations system, hosting 52 UN organizations, helping them to cooperate and collaborate, coordinate on environmental matters. And as part of this coordination and collaboration, we convene a lot of dialogues and discussions around environmental dimensions of the Sustainable Development Goals called Nexus Dialogues. And in that spirit, we look into emerging issues, challenges relating to implementation of the SDGs, with the focus, of course, and the lens on environmental dimensions, with the focus, of course, on the implementation of the multilateral environmental agreements. And then we try to bring all actors, in particular from within the UN system, but also the other actors outside of the UN system, to discuss these challenges and also the opportunities for collaboration. So this series of dialogues relating to the subsidies was initially proposed by the government of Switzerland. I think all of us are aware of the significant impact and the role that the subsidies are expected actually to play in bridging the financial gap for the implementation of the Paris Agreement, for the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. The numbers are about trillions and billions, and Bala knows that much better than me in terms of the exact figures. And we also know that this gap will actually stay there if we do not provoke discussions relating to repurposing the current subsidies and understanding the challenges from a different scale, at global scale, but also at the country level scale, knowing that each country has its own specificities and specific conditions. And also would like to understand the role that the UN system can play in helping countries finding the right solutions. Of course, focusing on integrated and coherent solutions at the country level, where all sectors, all ministries will work together in transiting from this traditional socioeconomic subsidies into environmental subsidies that would not only help the economic and social, but also help the environmental sectors as well. So with this dialogues, we would like to understand the so far experiences of the various actors, especially at the UN level. In the first dialogue, we actually heard some presentations relating to the definitions of these subsidies and also the methodologies for calculating and measuring the impact, which was very helpful. In this one, today, we would like to focus a lot on the case studies in different sectors, agriculture, food, and trade relating to fisheries. You will hear, please, if I may ask you to mute your phone, or yeah, if you can, yeah, thanks a lot. So that today we would focus on the issues relating to the case studies and also understanding what has been the best practices relating to this transition, experience of the various UN organizations. And then the third dialogue, we would focus on case studies, especially from the country level. So we hope that out of these discussions, we can provide a compendium. If I may ask again to mute your mics, please, because that disturbs our conversation. Thanks a lot. And if you can also, Laura, help to mute them or force the muting from our side, technically, that would be great. So basically, as a result of these consultations and discussions, we would like to prepare a compendium of existing tools that we are proposing as a UN system. We also would like to propose a set of um, policy messages to policymakers, especially those who are going to the COPs of MEAs. We are having in front of us the COP of Biodiversity Convention, the Climate Convention, and also the Desertification Convention. And all of them, in one way or another, are dealing with this issue of subsidies. So we hope to provide them with a set of suggestions and recommendations on how, first of all, the UN system can help them, but also what needs to be done at the country level, and what are the short, medium, and long-term approaches that can be applied to help countries. One thing that I would specifically would like the speakers to speak while presenting their cases is also talk about opportunities for collaboration. What are the challenges in bringing a more coherent understanding and approach towards these issues of subsidies and repurposing them? Because my sense as a non-expert in this field is that there is a lot of scattered activities and efforts, but there is no convener to bring more coherence and continuity and shape to this discussion, moving it forward. So with those points, and without further ado, I would like to pass it on to my colleague, Bala Krishna Pisupati, dear colleague from UNEP, heading the policy program, the policy coherence, environmental policy coherence unit of UNEP, and also he has been recently assigned as UNEP representative in India. Congratulations, Bala. To moderate this discussion. And before that, I would highly like to also thank the colleagues of ours in the UN system who have accepted to join and to present their experiences. It has not been easy to gather this set of experts. Honestly, in the last few months, Laura has been really contacting colleagues, and we are really grateful for you to have put your time here. All of the presentations would be highly valuable. So thank you so much from the very outset to all of you who have accepted to come to make these presentations. Thank you, all of you. And Bala, I hand it over to you and look forward to a wonderful discussion. Thanks a lot. And to you, Bala.
Thank you. Thank you, Hussein. Laura, just to confirm that I'm audible. Good. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues. Great to be a part of this series, but most importantly, the second in a series of webinars being put together by the Environment Management Group. I'm sure you've heard a bit of a background and the expectations from Hussein in terms of not just this particular webinar, but also in the series. Those of us who are online, but those of us who actually very intricately and closely follow the negotiations and discussions that are upcoming in the coming weeks between now and end of December, we have three major governing body meetings of multilateral environmental agreements, the Rio Conventions, the Conference of Parties to the Biodiversity Convention, the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and also the Conference of Parties to the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And if there is one agenda, in addition to effective implementation of these multilateral environmental agreements, that is common to all of the COPs, it's going to be the issue of financing. How is that we are going to raise adequate and predictable finances for implementing and realizing the objectives and goals, but also make meaning to the decisions that are being made through these conference of parties? But of course, the challenge when it comes to environmental management and governance, many of you or all of you would recognize, is that the demands for the amount of money is ever increasing. We require more and more resources. But at the same time, we also know that that particular, bag of resources is not going to be ever expanding as we actually wish them to expand. So the critical issue that needs to be addressed at global level, at national, and also at the sub-national levels is that how is that we are going to be looking at raising or repurposing the available finances more effectively so that every dollar that is invested and spent gets us the best possible returns for the investments, not just for a particular sector of climate change or biodiversity or pollution or land degradation, but how is that we are going to be maximizing the impacts or maximizing the returns on a number of issues that are going to be cross-cutting. And in that regard, I'd like to sort of mention a couple of quick points before we, invite the learned panelists, a brilliant set of panelists who will be speaking about the issue of subsidies. And for those of you who follow the discussions, for example, under the Convention on Biological Diversity, $500 billion needs to be repurposed if we want to raise the $700 billion required to achieve the global biodiversity framework. And we hear very similar numbers when it comes to climate, when it comes to adaptation, when it comes to food systems, all of those kinds of things. So it is very important for us, both who actually work on the policy issues, but also for those who work on implementation of many of these programs at the national level, to understand where we stand when it comes to discussions on subsidies. Very challenging discussion, whether it is at the level of G7 or G20, or whether it is at the level of national implementation, is the intent to repurpose subsidies. But all of us struggle in terms of how do we actually make that repurposing work? What are the numbers that actually are indicating whether we are succeeding or failing? Last year, in a series of reports that was launched by the UN Environment Program under the title of State of Finance for Nature, there was actually an indication that the nature negative finances have actually increased to $7 trillion per year. And that's a 55% increase in harmful subsidies compared to the 2021 figure. I'm just sort of mentioning it so that we actually understand and recognize the nature, but also the volume of the challenge that we have. So repurposing subsidies is definitely going to be an important, an obvious element that countries and stakeholder groups need to address. Having said that, one critical element when it comes to subsidies is many of us who actually work on these issues understand that policy making or implementation of repurposing elements of it cannot only be done by having global decisions, because a lot of these are influenced by national political situations, national socioeconomic conditions, and a number of these elements that are very, very critical. So what we intend to do through a series of 5 presentations today, with colleagues and experts coming from a number of different organizations, including the Global Environment Facility. We have colleague Sonja Teelucksingh from the GEF Secretariat, who will be speaking on the issue of how do we actually focus on coherent policies when we want to look at repurposing subsidies. And as you know, all of you, the Global Environment Facility serves as the financing mechanism for the multilateral environmental agreements. So she basically will be setting a bit of a scene, setting the tone for the subsequent presentations. But having said that, if you look at where the sectors in which the subsidies are at the maximum, we all recognize agriculture, fossil fuels, fisheries, and forestries actually top that particular list. And exactly those are the sectors, those are the topics that the 4 other presenters today are going to be focusing on, coming from the World Trade Organization, where we have colleague Svetlana, who is from the Trade and Environment Division, who will be speaking on the fossil fuel and the fisheries subsidies. We have Nicolette Bettini following her from Riksbank, who will be speaking about the agricultural subsidies. She is a senior advisor there, followed by colleague Mansoor Ahmed from World Bank, who is a senior economist, who will be speaking about repurposing agricultural subsidies. And we will wrap up today's presentation by a colleague from FAO, Marco Sanchez, who actually is the Deputy Director and Officer in charge for the MAFAC program under the Agriculture, Food, Economic and Policy Division of FAO, who will be speaking about another interesting element of it. What happens if subsidies are not repurposed from a socio-economic perspective? A brilliant set of speakers, so I won't take too much of your time, but welcome and ensure that you all engage in the discussions. And if you have any questions or if you have any comments, feel free to use the chat function to put your question or comments, but you will also have enough opportunity to raise your questions once we hear the presentations. So maybe we will, at this point of time, I'd like to invite colleague Sonja from the GEF Secretariat. Over to you, Sonja, to set the scene on policy coherence and subsidies related discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bala and colleagues, for organizing this seminar and for also having me to present. Just to confirm, you can hear me and also see my presentation? Yes. Okay,
yes, if you can make it to the presenters mode.
Yeah, I will do. Yeah.
Sure, thank you.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
fine.
Right. So my name is Sonja Teelucksingh. I work at the Global Environment Facility here in DC. So greetings from DC. And I'm the advisor to the CEO. And I'm going to talk today, as Bala said, on policy coherence and subsidy reforms. So who are we? And this is a slide I think we often need to start our presentations with, because sometimes we find many people don't know who the Global Environment Facility is. So the Global Environment Facility, we are an organization based in DC. We were established over 30 years ago to be the financing mechanism for the 3 Rio conventions. And in the last 30 plus years, our mandate has expanded to a series of multilateral environmental agreements. We have a replenishment every 4 years, which is roughly about $4 to $5 billion every 4 to 5 years. And we work across a series of countries, developing countries. And we have a large portfolio, both of completed projects, of active projects on the ground, and of projects and programs that are currently being formulated. We recently set up the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund as part of our family of funds. And of course, this fund speaks directly to the Global Biodiversity Framework, of which Target 18 on reforming subsidies is a part. So a lot of our work has been and is directly contributing to the topic under discussion today. So just in terms of some scene setting, we hear a lot of talk in the last, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, about the nature financing gap, or the nature funding gap, or the climate and nature gap. And what is this? I mean, this is the resources that are needed to turn the tide on the negative trends to sustainable development. And there have been many studies that try to estimate what this gap looks like, what this gap is, in order to try to find ways to fill the gap, so that we can make a difference to our sustainable development goals by 2030. But out of all of these different estimates, which can be varied and wide, there are a few factors that are true. One is that the gap exists, one is that the gap is wide, and one is that the gap needs to be narrowed. So even though we may have different views as to what those numbers actually look like, we are all, I think, and this is reflected in many international conversations at the MEA level, in the different COPs, from declarations of different groups. It's very well recognized that we have a nature financing gap. So the nature financing gap, if you have a gap, it can be closed or narrowed in 2 ways: by either increasing the funding that's going to the gap, or decreasing the need for the funding to the gap. And this is where policy coherence comes into play. Policy coherence is one approach to addressing one aspect of the nature funding gap, or the nature financing gap. How we define policy coherence is as this: the systematic promotion of mutually reinforcing policy actions across government departments and agencies, creating synergies towards achieving the agreed objectives. So what does that mean? In the context of the nature financing gap, what this means is that we recognize we have a gap of financing to nature. And if we put money into that gap, but at the same time, those funds are being channeled towards activities that harm nature, then we're actually not closing the gap, and whatever short-term impact we have on the gap will then not be sustainable into the future. And that's why, one of my favorite analogies of this is the water going into a bucket with holes. So most of the time, funding going towards nature is ODA, is coming from donor countries. And the more that we put ODA into countries that have policy incoherence, those funds are then not being used in a way that will have a sustainable positive impact on nature. So like pouring water into a bucket with holes. Now, these are grand objectives. And as our initial remarks pointed out, a lot of this depends on specific country context, a lot of parameters, some of which are in control of governments, some of which can be under the control of international organizations or international treaties, and some of which are in the hands of the actual stakeholders on the ground, the actual communities. So how do we actually get there? We know we have a nature financing gap. We know policy coherence is one of the ways to sustainably impact that gap. But then how do we actually achieve that? And so this is where, again, sometimes we find we need to bring more clarity into actually how this occurs, other than just, identifying the problem and knowing what the solution needs to be. We need to find ways to bridge that gap, no pun intended. And so, hence international conventions. The CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, had identified since the Aichi targets the need for reforming, repurposing, eliminating harmful incentives. So Aichi Target 3, which was in the 2000s, has then got translated to the GBF Target 18. And the GBF is the agreement that was reached in the COP-15 a year and a half ago. And the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund at the GEF Secretariat has been set up specifically to address the GBF goals and targets, one of which is Target 18. So Aichi Target 3, which CBD reports identify was not achieved, is now GBF Target 18. So the question is, and I go back to this slide, what happened? What were the factors that stopped us from achieving Aichi Target 3? And how can we impact those factors to assure that the same situation is not repeated and we end up not achieving GBF Target 18? So this is where the policy coherence agenda comes into play. And at the GEF Secretariat, this is an agenda that we've had growing, we're growing into that space. Policy coherence can help to narrow the nature financing gap. It can help to align, catalyze, and mobilize resources from different sources in a sustainable way. It can create the enabling environment and eliminate perverse incentives that may conflict with nature conservation efforts. It brings together sectors, ministerial departments, and institutions. It's a component of the whole of government approach, as well as the whole of society approach. It helps to maximize investments into nature, and it can ensure the sustainability of results. Now, ever since the GEF was created, policy change and to some extent policy coherence has been a part of that agenda. And we have mapped over time the fact that we have an increasing and advancing agenda on policy coherence. And in the last 4 years in our GEF 8 cycle, we have explicitly hardwired policy coherence into how we're programming. And we're looking to advance that as we approach our GEF 9 cycle, which will begin in 2 years, and the negotiations of which will begin in a few months' time. So what are we doing in terms of policy coherence at the GEF? Well, as I said, we're mainstreaming or hardwiring it into the design and implementation of projects now, which are under our GEF 8 cycle. And we have a series, in addition to having policy coherence as an explicit parameter of our programming, we also have a few dedicated financing activities that are looking to map that space of policy coherence and figure out that missing link or the miracle of one of the previous slides in that cartoon. We're working very much at the country level. So in reference to one of the earlier interventions in terms of country-specific factors very much determining policy coherence and subsidy reform, we have at the GEF, we're a country-driven approach to programming. So we have a series of country engagement activities that take place, and we are bringing policy coherence and subsidy reform explicitly into those conversations in the last 2 years. We have our sights on various knowledge activities and products as a result of all of these initiatives. And we're also, we have about 1,000 active projects on the ground from previous cycles that have some potential to have policy impact as well. So we're currently assessing that portfolio. And then we're trying to develop tools and indicators for policy coherence and for subsidy reform. So this is actually my last slide, to be fair to my fellow presenters, so I don't take too much time. I just want to conclude by mentioning that we actually have, the GEF Secretariat is organizing a conference on Target 18 at the CBD COP. It's entitled Creating the Right Incentives for a Nature Positive Future. And we're doing this in conjunction with a series of organizations, including the CBD Secretariat. And this will be in Cali on the 27th of October, where we're bringing together representatives from various elements of society, including ministers, including private sector, including philanthropies, to actually come and discuss how this is going to work in practice, and what has been done so far, what are the successes, what have been the challenges, what can we learn, and how can we do some kind of roadmap going forward. So in conclusion, we're all very much part of the same conversation. I think we're all recognizing that target 18 of the GBF is critical to us turning the tide on sustainable development, making sure that we put funds into nature conservation and that these funds are being used in a sustainable way and in ways that have the correct impact now and for the future, so that we can turn the tide on environmental degradation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sonja. Very much on time. Thanks a lot for giving the perspective, especially focusing on the issue of the need for coherence. And for those colleagues who follow the discussions on policy coherence, I'm sure you recognize that the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 17, Target 14, has a specific indicator encouraging countries to actually use policy coherence as an important element to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. But now, increasingly, several multilateral processes, including the COP-15 of the convention, had recognized and requested and requires countries and parties to actually look at policy coherence as an important enabler for effective implementation of the decisions and the objectives of the convention. So from UNEP, we're very, very closely working with GF and a number of other colleagues in terms of some of the elements of upscaling the discussions from sustainable development to environmental governance. But certainly the key point there is that unless coherence actually is addressed at different levels, the discussions on subsidies and repurposing subsidies will definitely remain a challenge. Thanks, Sonja, for your presentation. And now we'll move to the next presentation by our colleague from the World Trade Organization, Svetlana Chobanova, who will be speaking on the subsidies related to fossil fuels and fisheries. Over to you, Svetlana.
Thank you very much, Bala. I hope you can hear me well. And are you able to see the presentation that I just shared? Sorry,
yes.
I was sharing it myself. Right now, I'm not sure if it's me sharing or someone else. Okay, let me try again. All right.
Yes, you're on. Please go ahead.
Yes, super. Thank you so much. So I will talk a little bit about the incentives or the initiative, that the WTO is undertaking in the field of addressing harmful subsidies, and more specifically zoom on the fishery subsidies and fossil fuel subsidies. And just a word beforehand that there are also negotiations on agriculture, which I'm not going to talk about right now, but which also as part of these negotiations address trade distorting domestic support. There has not been yet agreement reached on these negotiations. At our last ministerial conference earlier this year, several issues have been raised, especially in the context of domestic support, including how to treat public stock takings, definitions, categories of support, etc. But just to mention, this is also one of the ongoing let's say, sets of work for the WTO. What I will focus today on is, first, I'm going to talk about fishery subsidies, and more specifically, our recently concluded agreement on fishery subsidies. I'm going to give an overview of it, and then I'm going to talk about our group on tackling fossil fuel subsidies. So moving on our fisheries agreement, how did it come to being? So already in 2001, there was a mandate. Sorry, I don't know why these are moving by themselves. There was a mandate at one of our ministerial conferences in Doha to clarify and improve the existing rules on subsidies with a link to the environment and developing members and LDC's concerns. Apologies, this is moving by itself. I hope you're seeing it. I'm not really sure what's going on. At this event and later in 2005 in Hong Kong, this mandate was elaborated further, and the negotiation mandate was given to prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies that contribute specifically to overcapacity and overfishing, together with corresponding provisions on special and differential treatment for developing countries. Now, specific impetus was given to these negotiations in 2015 with the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals, and specifically under Target 14.6. Parties were required by 2020 to prohibit certain forms of fisheries subsidies, which contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and eliminate subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing, so-called illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing, again with certain provisions for developing countries. And then at MC11, there was a mandate to conclude the negotiations in 2 years by 2019. In reality, what happened was that finally the agreement on fisheries came to exist with the MC12 ministerial conference on June 2022. So at this date, there was a decision to open the acceptance of a protocol to amend the Marrakesh Agreement. This is the founding WTO agreement, with this agreement on fishery subsidies. What does that mean? It means that the agreement is right now concluded. However, in order for it to enter into force, two-thirds of WTO memberships, 166 currently members, have to deposit their protocols of acceptance, and then it would enter into force. We are doing well, but still we haven't reached these two-thirds just yet. And it was also accepted that on certain outstanding issues, and I'll mention those briefly, members would continue negotiations with a view to complementing the provisions of the agreement. We consider this as a historical achievement. Why? Because first of all, this is the first WTO agreement which specifically focuses on environmental sustainability. And also, it's just the second agreement that was reached at the WTO since 1995, since its inception. Apologies again for this mishap with the slides. So, a brief overview of the agreement and what is its scope. There are 3 specific prohibitions that the agreement puts into place: subsidies for IUU fishing, as I said, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Prohibitions for these subsidies, prohibitions on subsidies to overfish stocks, and prohibitions for subsidies for fishing in the unregulated high seas. There are also other disciplines that are complementing the agreement, and it's especially to take special care and exercise restraint when subsidizing vessels that fly another member's flag, essentially, or fishing or subsidies for fishing on unassessed stocks. And there is an exception to these 2 categories, that these 2 categories of subsidies could be granted for disaster relief. There are also cross-cutting disciplines on institutional arrangements, notifications, and transparency of such subsidies in order to basically increase transparency and knowledge of what members are granting, and also technical assistance for developing countries. Just briefly, there are also provisions for special and differential treatment for developing members. This is part of the WTO agreements, so members, if they wanted to, could bring a dispute under our WTO dispute settlement system if they consider that another member has breached the provisions of this agreement. And furthermore, it's subject to a termination clause, which essentially means that if in 4 years the WTO members are not able to agree on the provisions that are supposed to complement, and I'll speak about this in a minute, the substance of this agreement, the agreement would be terminated. This was something that was requested for certain members that thought that this is a good start, but the scope is still very specific, that other categories of prohibitions, especially for overfishing and for overcapacity, should also become part of the agreement. And if no agreement is basically reached to complement with these provisions, then the agreement would not make sense just as it stands, and it would lapse. Now, just a word about the special and differential treatment of the agreement. There is a peace clause, meaning that for developing and LDC members, a dispute cannot be brought in the first 4 years after entry into force of the agreement for certain categories of prohibitions. There is also more lenient provisions on notifications of certain fisheries-related information and specific technical assistance and capacity building that would be granted to developing members. There are also specific flexibilities specifically for least developed country members, which basically say that WTO members would exercise due restraint in raising matters involving such LDC members. An innovative also solution with this agreement is the establishment of a fish fund. So basically the idea is that a voluntary WTO funding mechanism that is supported largely by funding from developed country members of the WTO would be put in place, in essence, to create and integrate more coherence between subsidies policies of developing countries and fishery sustainability. Again, there are certain purposes of the fund, but the idea is to make the implementation of the agreement more meaningful, more coherent, and more sustainable for fisheries. And just a brief word again, this is a very brief overview, happy to elaborate on that if necessary. But what are the next steps? As I said, 2/3 of the membership has to deposit their instruments of acceptance for it to enter into force. There was an MC12 decision. In the MC12 decision, members agreed to continue the negotiations. MC12 is the ministerial conference that happened in February this year. Agreement could not be reached on enlarging the provisions of the fisheries agreement, so they agreed to continue the negotiations, and hopefully this more meaningful enlarging the scope of the agreement would be concluded in 2 years, since ministerial conference at the WTO take place with this frequency. And the idea is specifically to include further disciplines on certain forms of fishery subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And as I mentioned, finally, this termination clause, the idea of it is that if there is no agreement to including these further categories of subsidies, then the agreement would terminate, unless, of course, all members agree otherwise. So this is the main overview of this agreement, which we consider meaningful, if only a first step to ensuring sustainability, in this case for fisheries at the WTO. And the other thing I would like to talk about is the fossil fuel subsidy reform initiative. That is a different animal. It's not an agreement. There's no negotiating mandate. And it's actually more of a discussion for the moment group between certain, not all WTO members, with the idea, however, to create certain impetus behind this fossil fuel subsidy reform, and perhaps to enlarge discussions to the entire memberships, hopefully in the future, and take further steps. So this initiative is part of 3 environmental initiatives that were launched at the WTO in 2021. The first one on trade and environmental sustainability is more horizontal. It tackles different topics at the intersection of trade and the environment, like climate change, environmental goods and services, circular economy, sustainable value chain. The other 2 initiatives are more specific in scope, one dealing with plastic pollution, and then the other one dealing with the one I'm briefly going to outline, fossil fuel subsidy reform. What's specific for these initiatives is, as I said, not all WTO members are willing to participate in them, but still quite an important part of the membership, also in terms of world trade, percentage of world trade participates in them. They complement the regular work of our Committee on Trade and Environment. And what is specific about them is that they have a very inclusive approach. So normally committees at the WTO work only as discussions amongst members. Here, engagement of stakeholders is very much encouraged, and these would include international organizations, civil society, private sector, etc. So the fossil fuel subsidy reform is coordinated by New Zealand as a member, and it right now has 48 co-sponsors. Now, what it seeks is the rationalization and phase out of harmful fossil fuel subsidies through the use of both existing mechanisms and through developing new pathways for reform. It recognizes that this reform has to take into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries. And also it recognizes the importance of a WTO as a forum for discussions. Why the WTO? Well, mainly because we have behind us already quite a lot of knowledge. We have our own subsidies agreement, which granted tackles more trade distortions rather than environmental distortions of subsidies, but it did used to have a green box, meaning that in the past, actually certain green subsidies were excluded from the provisions of the agreement. This is a provision that lapsed years ago. But there is an understanding that the WTO also holds the most widely recognized definition of what is a subsidy and has a lot of institutional knowledge, also notification obligations on subsidies more generally. That is why the fishery subsidies and hopefully these further discussions on fossil fuel subsidies are seen as appropriately hosted by the WTO as a forum. This is not to diminish that obviously there are very important other initiatives by other organizations in the field. So just briefly, because I think I've run out of time, there are three pillars. Let's talk about this. There are three pillars of work under this fossil fuel subsidy reform initiative. First two being more specific, short-term, practical ones. The first one is on enhancing transparency through the use of existing WTO mechanisms. And here, for example, the co-sponsors of the initiatives have reached an agreement on a list of questions regarding fossil fuel subsidies and their reform that they are now regularly posing at WTO trade policy reviews. So at WTO trade policy reviews, all members go through a review every couple of years of their entire trade policies. And the asking of these systematic questions has the idea of creating more transparency, more systematic institutional knowledge and discussions on the subsidies and also on the steps that each member has to undertake to reform them. The second pillar is on crisis support measures and more specifically on how to phase out and also manage the temporary support measures that had been phased in with the recent energy crisis. And I think perhaps Bala alluded to the fact that huge fossil fuel subsidies have increased hugely since 2021. Right now, members are starting to phase them down, but not enough. And the idea here is let's not let this temporary support become embedded. Let's try to manage and phase it out. And the third pillar of work, which is the most ambitious, the most long-term, is to identify the most harmful categories of fossil fuel subsidies, both looking at their trade effects, but also looking, of course, at their environmental effects. So the idea is to start to develop a grid of the key types of fossil fuel subsidies depending on their harm, and slowly start creating also priorities for reform and guide governments on where to start with the reform and phasing out of fossil fuel subsidies. Thank you very much. I'm going to stop here and I'm looking forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. Thank you very much, because I'm sure more than colleagues in the WTO, a number of environmental organizations, including UNEP, celebrated when we had the first agreement on environment. But of course, the time is ticking and we expect the countries to walk the talk. 4 years is not too big a time, and we've already lost some time in terms of countries agreeing to be a part of this. And certainly, if you're going to combine, according to some estimates, the fossil fuel subsidy and the agricultural subsidy, it's close to 89%, in terms of the volumes of the subsidies that we are actually looking at. An extremely important, set of discussions that are happening. And for colleagues who will be in Baku for the climate COP, I'm sure you would have heard that just a few hours ago, the discussions related to financing had concluded with not much of a progress on identifying, but certainly, some of the elements that Svetlana had mentioned did find a place in the discussions in the run-up to COP. So thanks a lot. A lot of ideas, a lot of issues that we should start having at the back of our minds as we move forward. Now we will hear from our colleague Nicolette Bettini from Sveriges Riksbank, who will be speaking on agricultural subsidies. Over to you, Nicoletta.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very glad to be here. I'm trying to open my presentation. Let me know if you can see it.
Go ahead and put it in the presenters mode if possible. Thank you.
Can you see it? No. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So it should be full screen.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So I've been asked to talk about agricultural subsidies. So we talked about subsidies to fisheries, fossil fuels. Of course, subsidies to agriculture are no less in importance and potential harmful effects to people and planet. And I have a few slides on this, and I'm an economist by background, so I'm going to concentrate some of the economic implications of this as well as environmental. So the key facts are that it's been calculated that the vast majority of countries' food and agriculture subsidies range cumulatively to around 0.3 to 0.7% of GDP over the last 15 years. And the current support system consists primarily of price incentives, like import tariffs and export subsidies, but there are also fiscal subsidies tied to production of specific commodities or inputs. And in 2020, 2021, I contributed to a big report by the UNEP, UNDP, FAO, called the multi-billion-dollar opportunity, repurposing agricultural support. And there we showed that the vast proportion of the at the time 540 billion annual government support at the global level was actually inducing measures that are either price distorting or that could be harmful to nature and health. And we did call that report for a repurpose, not an elimination of these incentives, but a repurposing of incentives to achieve more of those sustainable development goals that comprise the 2030 agenda. And the so to be able to realize the UN Decade of Ecosystem Restoration. So let me move slide. The actual, so this chart is taken by from a publication by David Laborde, who was one of the contributors as well of this report. And basically this figure shows the total amount of annual government support divided by developing and developed countries. You can see that, they're kind of neck to neck, and the sum to the amount I mentioned before, which, by the way, has gone up in, over time further. And it also shows in color, these are stacked bars, that, the market price support, which is the blue, mainly consists of border measures. Then you have coupled subsidies to input or level of agricultural output, which is the orangey part. Then there is some direct transfers to producers, that's the gray part. And then general service support expenditure, GSSE, which include other forms of support, such as agricultural innovation systems, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, and rural infrastructure. The findings, both in the report and in David Laborde et al., show that coupled subsidies, so the orange part of these stacked bars, do stimulate agricultural output and emissions, while the agricultural trade interventions, the blue part of the stacked bar, reduce emissions as compared with the situation without these interventions. Not all subsidies work in the same direction, and that's where the idea of repurposing subsidies comes in. Some of these yellow subsidies I've studied. I was doing when I'm permanent at the IMF, with doing the mission to the United States, talking to the APA and the White House. Of course, some of these subsidies, for example, of phytosanitary or rural infrastructure, they also qualify under environmental subsidies or green subsidies. But the truth of the matter is that, sometimes just a pipe that takes the manure from the pig farm down the river so that it doesn't pollute the neighborhood, but it pollutes, down the line. So one has to be extremely careful when we talk about green subsidies or repurposing subsidies, because as we know, there's a lot of government and agency capture, and this is a very slippery territory. Just to give you a sense of who is spending what, here's a bar chart from Chatham House, just showing, of course, China topping the league here in subsidies, but followed at little distance, certainly less intense in per capita terms than the European Union, United States, and of course Japan. So if we were to concentrate on 3 regions, these would be the regions that we would put most of our Pareto energy. And but China, as you know, has a sort of original sin in the famine of the late 50s, and for them, food is one of the main security items on the agenda, whereas the EU is long past that mark, has the US. So there are very different reasons why countries do spend money on subsidies, and I think of these two. Seriously, I think the EU and the US are perhaps the one that could think more heavily about repurposing without major impacts on food security. Let me move on. I just wanted to explain why, and I'm sure most of you know why, but I just reminded myself and just giving a couple examples why agricultural subsidies are wrong in the current status. So the first argument is price distortion. Here I have an example from the US. So US agricultural subsidies, the pie chart to the left in red and yellow shows where they go as a percent of total. You can see that 84% of agricultural subsidies in the United States go to grains and 15% go to meat and dairy. And then there's a very tiny slice going to fruits and veg, fresh produce. So clearly, this is a corn distorted machinery where products and byproducts are financed in a very concentrated fashion, and they mostly go to serve the meat and dairy industry. So even financing of grains in support form is meant to subsidize a crop for animal feed. In fact, if you look at the use of grains, which is the middle of this chart, pie chart, it shows that 42% of all subsidies go to animal feed in the grain subsidy category, and 12 go to ethanol, which also has been considered not a good idea from an environmental perspective. What that means in terms of prices is shown in the last chart here, the chart to the right, and which shows on an axis the percentile of cents per calorie, the distribution of food energy prices. So how much does a calorie, which of the foods shown in the legend here, different colors, goes? And as you can see, fruits and vegetables come out of the system of subsidies as being the very most expensive items in the grocery cart in the US. And what that means is basic, and of course, grain is the cheapest, as is to some extent meat and dairy. And so what that means is that people are, of course, incentivized to consume greater amounts of meat and dairy than they would probably desire based on a price decision. And so this is how subsidies translate very directly into price distortions that then inform behavior, both at the supply and the demand front. Subsidies also lead to a concentration of production. So they tend to be concentrated on a few single commodities. And here is again a chart from Chatham House that shows globally subsidies by type of commodity. You can see a lot of them goes to rice, pig meat, beef, and veal, wheat, and refined sugar. And that absorbs the lion's share of subsidies. And obviously this is, I mean, if you, as I suppose, know something about diets, this is probably not where we want to put our money, and certainly not all our money, because diets have to be diversified, and we also need diversity in the kind of foods that we produce, including types of grains and ancient grains and genetically more nutrient grains than the ones that the industry tends to cluster around because of a subsidy convenience. Another thing that subsidies, of course, lead to is a situation of overproduction and global market concentration and share monopolies. So to get subsidies, you need to have well-informed and well-capacitated legal offices, and large companies tend to mop up the lion's share of subsidies in most countries, and that means that it becomes like a vicious circle where companies like Bunge or Tyson here, this is just the U.S. market, control a share that is way above what's considered healthy from a market competition point of view. Globally, there are 8 industrial complexes, agricultural complexes that completely dominate input-output on the global supply chain, including, of course, the top of those is Cargill Inc. And then you have BASF that just recently finalized acquisition of assets from Bayer that in turn had purchased Monsanto, Archer, Daniels Midland, and so forth. And that means that it's easier to get government capture. It's easier to bypass and manipulate some of these environmental, not just enforcements, but also ambitions under international coordination treaties. So, having said this, we have witnessed in the last years a good number of positive reform examples on the subsidies front. I just want to mention a few. The zero budget natural farming in the Indian state of Andhra Pradesh. And there are several others in other countries. But this one, for example, is one where the government of Andhra Pradesh has launched a scale-out plan to transition 6 million farms to 100% chemical-free agriculture by 2024. And it's an unprecedented transformation towards sustainable agriculture at such scale. And the good thing is that it also aims to create the human and social capital necessary for an inclusive agricultural production. So it doesn't stop with the transformation. Actually, transformation continues through shared practices. The UK, following the exit from the European Union, has taken responsibility for most of farm subsidies and has moved over a 4-year plan to cut the regional subsidies received by British farmers, and launched what it called an environmental land management scheme, also called ELMS, which is calculated on the basis of so-called income foregone, or what farmers could have otherwise made from farming on the same land, plus the estimated cost of environmental work. And this is based on 3 pillars. The first is a sustainable farming incentive, which basically pay farmers to adopt and maintain sustainable farming practices that can protect and enhance the natural environment alongside food production. A second pillar is the country stewardship, CS, which pays for more targeted actions related to specific locations and habitats. And third, the landscape recovery pillar, which pays for bespoke long-term larger scale projects to enhance the natural environment. There's also other examples, for example, from Senegal, the Programme d'Accélération au Rate of Senegalese Agriculture, which also incentivizes farmers to cultivate more crops. They reform the cap and so forth. So there are plenty of examples one can draw from. And in the book, well, say the report that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, we did come up with a number of steps that can be taken. And so I would just like to conclude so we can leave time to the next speaker, and say that the current food system, as we know, is neither healthy nor sustainable. And we know that imbalanced diets are caused to the greatest mortality burden globally from non-transmittable diseases related to diets and dietary risk factors. When it comes to the environment, the current food system is responsible for a third of all GHG emissions and over 3/4 of all freshwater resources. I haven't even talked about fisheries. I'm just talking about land agriculture, which of course has an impact also on fisheries. But current subsidies, the way they are in agriculture, favor the state of affairs, this unhealthy, non-sustainable practice, because they foster concentration, the mechanization of the business and farming, they're nature negative, and they induce price fixing. And so it's possible and desirable to reform the structure of these subsidies, like for other subsidies that are nature negative. We explained that these changes, however, have to be holistic and transparent. They have to involve various stakeholders. You can't, just completely cut subsidies overnight and leave farmers on the street, because then you don't have food. So this is extremely dangerous. It has to be done gradually, and changes have to be owned and must be win-win for farmers. And it's important to consider the political economy of this. I mean, going cold into things. And sometimes I believe, some of the latest measures that we've seen, both regionally and domestically in some countries, they're being too fast, too soon, and too, unnegotiated with parties involved. That can be very dangerous, can backfire. So, but I think, I've given, I hope, an overview of the problem with some key facts, and I'm happy to discuss more later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicoletta. Very, very, good presentation, especially the last couple of slides where you showed the positive, elements of it, and certainly, a couple of points, if I can pick up from that. One is to ensure that a lot of these reforms are done incrementally.
Yeah.
Two, that they focus on the poor and reduce the inequities, but also to demonstrate that such repurposing really helps. So that demonstration is something which is good, which is very, very critical. But of course, in the earlier part of your presentation, you did mention about some things which are very specific for countries. And that's where I reiterate the point that many times when we sit for multilateral negotiations, we actually assume, or many countries or the negotiators assume, that a one size will fit all. So let's take example experience from the European Union or from the US and see how they're going to fit a small country, which is either in the developing category or the least developed country category, and see whether a one size fit all approach is going to help. Certainly it will not. And that is where the examples you gave are extremely relevant. But a small point of concern for me, having reviewed some of the updated or the revised national biodiversity strategies and action plans for the Convention on Biological Diversity a couple of days ago, in terms of target 18 that our colleague Sonja had mentioned, it's not looking quite progressive in terms of how countries still have not started addressing this particular the big elephant in the room, and that is something which will possibly receive some attention during the forthcoming 16th meeting of the Conference of Parties in terms of strengthening, not just at the global level in terms of counting the numbers, but more at the national level on how countries are going to be responding to target 18 more specifically from the subsidies viewpoint. So thanks a lot, Nicolette, for that presentation. We'll move on to the next presentation from our colleague Mohammed Mansour Ahmed from the World Bank, who is a senior economist who will be speaking about a similar topic focusing on the repurposing of agricultural subsidies. Over to you, Mr. Ahmed. Ahmed, I think you need to unmute your microphone.
Yeah, can you
and
see my
put it in present.
presentation?
Yes, we
Yeah.
can see your presentation, hear you, but can you make it to the presenters mode? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, can you see my presentation now, or?
Perfect,
Okay.
go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this Nexus Dialogue on the repurposing subsidies. So, my name is Mansoor Ahmed. I actually work with a team which we call actually public policies and expenditure team at the World Bank, working particularly on the agricultural and food system. And I will be mainly talking about in couple of slides on the why repurposing is critical for the future of food system, and this part has been already made easy by my previous speaker Nicoletta. She already covered many of these many of these critical challenges for the food system, and then I'll be speaking mainly about what are the main activities from the efforts World Bank actually putting together for advancing the repurposing agenda, particularly the countries we are working and in partnership with our other organizations like FAO and ECO-FCDO and also German BMG. So if we basically, as Nicoletta presented, that actually our overall food system actually require a systematic shift. Our agricultural food system is at a crossroad, and the challenges of global warming, resource scarcity, and growing population, it is more important than ever to rethink actually how to produce, distribute, and also consume food. So securing affordable access to healthy, nutritious, and safe diet for the growing world population, especially amid the climate change and widespread resource degradation, is a major global challenge. And with this context, actually, we are actually discussing this question: do current policies and support create the incentives to drive this systematic shift? And could they be repurposed to better address the goals of prosperity, food security, climate change, and environmental sustainability? Yeah. So in the past, there has been a tremendous increase in agricultural productivity due to technological change and innovation over the 70 years. And agri-food system ensure food and nutrition security by contributing to feed a population that has tripled actually since 1960s. But at the same time, the current agri-food system is burdened by emerging pressures and challenges like climate change, conflict, COVID, and market volatility. And we see that actually on the right figure, there is a trends in food production per capita from 1980 to 2000, indicating that growth has slowed down actually since around 2010. And additionally, the long-term decline in the volatility of food production per capita has reversed since rising since the mid-20s, 200s. And at the same time, the exponential population growth between 1950 and 2000 significantly increased the demand for food. By 2050, an estimated about 10 billion people needs to be fed by the food system, which will require 70% additional food demand or food supply actually from the now on. And much of this increased demand will come from actually resource intensive, emission intensive actually products like meat and chicken, meat products. And at the same time, climate change is no longer a distant threat, as impacts on agricultural productivity growth are already being felt and accelerating. Since 1960s, climate change has slowed the productivity growth by 21% globally and as much as 40% in parts of Africa and other tropical zones. Therefore, it is already adversely affecting agriculture and threatening food security. And global agricultural productivity has been also declining in the recent decade. And as you have seen in the previous presentation as well, that agriculture not only a victim of or affected by the climate change, it also contributes to the climate change, and 1/3 of these emission actually or is generated contributed by agri-food system. Now, but the key question is, do current agricultural policies and support create the incentive to make agriculture more productive, sustainable, and nutrition sensitive? Probably not. For every subsidized dollar spent by government in the agriculture sector, production increase only by 35%. Definitely the subsidies, there are various types of subsidies. Some actually generate much higher return and some, but on average, actually, a significant proportion of support actually generate less income, less return than those who that contribute to the increasing return. So average return is much slower, much less, and as we see that much of this support goes to either coupled or market price support to the farmer. So that's actually distort the overall production system and also market. So how can agricultural measures be repurposed to provide incentive for sustainable food system transformation? And in last few years, World Bank and IFRI have looked at these issues jointly, and we have published this report in 2022 on repurposing on the potential outcomes or expected outcome from repurposing. So we have looked at multiple scenarios, like what if we remove all the subsidies? What if we actually make subsidies uniform, or what if we shift subsidy away from the emission intensive commodities? And also we will have looked at how about repurposing the subsidies towards green innovation, invest in research and development, and incentive for adoption of practices. And we'll see how it affects the productivity and reduce emission intensity. So in briefly, we have what we see here, that removal of domestic support have some desired outcome in terms of reducing emissions, but also it has important trade-offs, gains in efficiency and emission, but lower output and higher cost for healthy diets. And at the same time, if we compare it with the other two options, like environmental conditionality and repurposing of for green innovation, we see that actually for environmental conditionality, reduce GHG emission but lower productivity, raises cost of healthy diets, and leads to an agricultural land expansion. But repurposing for green innovation actually yields potential win-win, significantly income growth, less poverty, greater food security, and healthier diet. So clearly, actually, repurposing of subsidies yield much better outcome than the just putting conditionality into it. And finally, I will talk about like what are the efforts we are working on from the World Bank side, and then these are the activities. Actually, main activities we are doing, 5 set of activities we are doing, and all we are doing in collaboration with various partners like FAO, WP, World UK FCDO, German BMG, and IFRI as well. So first set of activities is actually global advocacy for repurposing of agricultural support. We disseminate the global knowledge and report on agricultural support and at various global events. We also organize global agricultural policy dialogue. So far, we have been organized 15 high-level technical dialogue at various occasions like COP and GFFA. And also we work with our other partner organizations on the agricultural incentive consortium. Second big set of activities are actually upstream country diagnostic. We work with our client countries and clients to understand their agricultural public policies and expenditure. What is the existing form of support, and through the agricultural policy and public expenditure review, we collaborate strongly with FAO, MEFAP. I think Mark will be speaking as well on this, and and also we right now about 40 agriculture public expenditure reviews either ongoing or completed so far, and all of these countries are actually working on identifying the repurposing options through this upstream analytic. Third set of activities are very interesting, as my previous presenter have mentioned, and you also mentioned about support to the repurposing project. So we are with support from FCDO and BMG. We are working with 7 countries to pilot on different various repurposing options to deliver subsidies to farmers, and what yield better result, and through a very solid impact evaluation. And these pilots are just started, and we hope that in 2-3 years we will get much better insights about the repurposing option. Finally, on the global analytical works, there are many ongoing reports and global reports we are working on. And some is like threat for food security in the era of geopolitical risks, climate change. Currently, we are working on understanding role of strategic gain reserve for food security. We will be working on the increasing the impacts of fertilizer support program in Africa. And also we work with other department in the World Bank to mainstream the repurposing agenda in other operations and activities as well. So I will stop here, and I will be happy to actually respond to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Mr. Ahmad. Thank you very much for the presentation, especially the last couple of graphs or the information you presented is extremely interesting, because globally we are moving away from quantity to quality. So that will have a significant impact in the way we are looking at repurposing subsidies. So we'll now move to the last presentation, and it's always a bit of a challenge when you moderate sessions like this, having speakers with enormous experience who would like to package years and years of information and experience into 5-7 minute presentations. So we always have a challenge of keeping time. But before we started the session, I promised Marco Sanchez, who is going to be our next speaker, that I'll be fair to him and give him enough time to make his presentation from FAO, who will be speaking about what happens if we do not repurpose subsidies from a socio-economic viewpoint. Sanchez, over to you. And before you start, Sanchez, colleagues, any of your comments, questions, inputs into these presentations, feel free to put it on the chat. We will be monitoring the chat and ensure that responses are provided. But please stay with us for a few more minutes so that we'll have some questions and comments and some interactive session that will happen after Marco's presentation. Marco, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bala. I trust you can hear me and you can see my full screen right now, right? Perfect. So let me try to be brief, since some very interesting aspects have been already said. I will be talking about the socioeconomic opportunity cost of not repurposing public support in food and agriculture. And, presenting some examples based on the experience here in FAO in supporting some countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Let me try to move my screen. Okay. So, I will not repeat what has been said. I've been having the pleasure to lead the 2 publications that you can see in the screen. The multi-billion-dollar opportunity, Nicoletta mentioned this report. And after that report, we have seen a plethora of reports, very good ones. I also have the privilege to lead on the SOFI report in 2022 on repurposing. And even after the SOFI, there are some more good reports, making a case. And what we learned from all these reports is that, of course, vast transfers are going to farmers. And there are serious concerns about the harmful impacts of some of this support on the sustainability, equity, and efficiency of agri-food systems. The global consensus after of this has been built. We need to repurpose agricultural public support to ensure that it actually helps make agri-food systems more efficient, equitable, and sustainable. Now, it is important to understand, you see, I'm talking here about agricultural support. I know this event is about subsidies, but it's important to understand that agricultural support does not only comprise subsidies. As you can see in this figure from the SOFI report 2022, the bulk of the support is actually channeled through price incentives. And there, in price incentives, what we have, of course, is border measures, call them, trade policies. And we also have market price support. And it's important that we are aware of that. But of course, fiscal transfers to producers are very important, as you can see in this graph. And here is where we have most of the subsidies to producers. But it's important to be aware that there are other forms of support, and Nicoletta also alluded to that, and my other presenters, the other presenters alluded to that. General services support, which don't target individuals as such, but affect the sector collectively, is much less compared to fiscal subsidies and price incentives. And subsidies to consumers take the lower share. Now, one important thing is to ask the question, is there space to repurpose public support in all countries? Well, instead of talking here about developing countries and developed countries, I'm talking here about income groups. And this table shows each type of policy support to food and agriculture as a share of the value of production, again, by country income group. And what you can see here is that clearly both lower middle income countries and low income countries are actually penalizing farmers, are actually penalizing producers through border measures and also market price support. And interestingly, and I want to focus on this part, is that low-income countries, have very low fiscal support. And actually, if you look at the subsidies to producers, they are very low compared to the other country groups. So at FAO, what we are working on is, supporting governments in low-income countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to understand if the current allocation of their modest public support across different policy support measures is really providing the best possible socioeconomic outcomes. So here again, we come, Bala, on the issue of quality, not only quantity, right? So let me tell you that FAO, what we are doing is through the MAFA program, we are monitoring public expenditures on food and agriculture, and we use a highly disaggregated classification framework that we build with countries themselves, with governments. And this is helping us to identify those expenditures that benefit agents in agriculture, both producers and consumers, but also the general support that more broadly benefits the sector. And we go all the way down to project and program levels to come up with a very detailed picture for every country of the public support. And this methodology is helping us to identify what we call the existing policy support space. So if you allow me to show the case of Ethiopia, for example, when we deploy this kind of methodology, you will have a space that is composed of about 289 policy measures. And here I'm not counting the financing of these measures, which can be many options. Now, if you look at this, we have a number of commodities and sectors, and every X here represents a policy. We have commodity subsidies for fertilizers, for seeds. We have the government expenditures in extension programs, R&D. We have all the government investments in rural roads, irrigation, etc., all by sector. So the key question here that we are trying to answer along with governments is, how can we know what is inefficient, inequitable, or unsustainable in such a large space? That's not an easy question to answer. And we have been trying to think carefully how to answer that question. And very recently from 2022 and also 2023, we have been able to come up with a policy optimization modeling tool in FAO that is helping us to build scenarios for the current budgets that we develop and validate with policymakers. And essentially, what we're trying to do to this tool is, try to say, okay, what is the policy space in a country? What are the policy instruments? What are the value chains that are being affected? And what are the financing options? So let's try to optimize these different policy instruments to pursue different objectives. And we work with the governments in defining those objectives and then in coming up with, the scenarios that make most sense for going forward. And here again, what we are trying to do is, trying to achieve the policy coherence that previous speakers were talking about. And for doing that, we also need to think about what we can do considering WTO rules and regulations. Now, let me just give you some examples so that this becomes more intuitive about on what we are doing with governments. So we have three sets of objectives that we call inclusive agricultural transformation objectives. And because this is a policy optimization tool, we try to maximize things or minimize things. We maximize agri-food GDP, subject to a number of constraints. we minimize rural poverty, we maximize rural off-farm employment. Most recently, we have been extending the tool to minimize the cost of a healthy diet. And we can, with policymakers decide, how to weight these priorities. We can give similar weights to all of them, or we can just deprioritize some of them depending on our dialogue with the policymakers on the ground. Now, what we start observing is very interesting because when we try to pursue these objectives, what we are trying to do is to, let's put it that way, optimally repurpose the existing budgets. So this is Uganda's public expenditure by type of policy support measure in two scenarios. One is the business as usual, meaning what will happen in 2025 if we keep the same allocation of the public support across different support measures that are down here. And the second column here represents what would happen in 2025 with the budget if we optimize it to pursue three objectives: maximize agri-food GDP, maximize jobs in rural areas of the farm, and minimize rural poverty. And what you can see here is that already in 1 year, your budget needs to start changing. What you have now is not optimal to pursue these objectives. So, for example, you would have to reduce your, allocation to irrigation. You will have to reduce your allocation to rural roads under the same budget, and you will have to start increasing, for example, your allocation to extension programs and fertilizer subsidies. And if you look at these reallocations by commodity, the picture is even more interesting, because what you will have in 2025, comparing to the actual situation, which is this one here, is a budget that will look very different when it comes to the allocation of the support measures across commodities to maximize agri-food GDP, minimize rural, maximize jobs, and minimize rural poverty. Now, we have applied this kind of framework to more countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And allow me just to show you one more example of how things need to be, let's say, optimally repurposed. What you have in this graph is public expenditure by policy support measure in the crops and livestock sector in 6 sub-Saharan African countries. Now, here I'm going from 2025 all the way to 2030, looking into the more medium-term gains. And what this graph in particular shows is the average deviations for this period between the optimal reallocation of the support measures to pursue 4 objectives, which I have here on the left-hand side, compared to the business as usual scenario where I don't do anything and I maintain the same, reallocation across measures that I see today. And this is interesting because you can see that for countries like Burkina Faso, for example, or Nigeria, there is ample space to repurpose optimally the support that they are now given. So a country like Burkina Faso, for example, would have to reduce, importantly, the support that they are giving through seed subsidies. And because it is the same budget, they could increase extension services, fertilizer subsidies. Now, if you see a country like Uganda, it has to repurpose very little. What does it mean? It means that Uganda would have, today, a quasi-optimal allocation of the budget. And I'm proud to say that because Uganda is a country with which you have been working for maybe 5 years doing this kind of analysis. Now, what would be the opportunity cost of not optimally repurposing their budgets like this? Well, what we are trying to talk about with governments is that the potential gains of optimally repurposing through this tool are huge. If you take 4 indicators, which are the 4 indicators associated with the objective that we're talking about here, you can see that in all these countries, there is an opportunity to, with the same budget, but optimally repurposing the allocations of support, you can lift thousands of people out of poverty, create many, many jobs in the rural areas of the farm, and shift millions of people out of a condition where they can not afford a healthy diet. And you can also have very impressive agri-food GDP gains. Altogether, what I put here is that, in these 5-6 countries only, with the same budget, but optimally repurposing the support, you can get 16 million people to afford a healthy diet. Now, to finalize, what are we doing with the country? The countries are now using this evidence to inform, development plans, sectoral investment plans, and budgeting. But of course, now we are trying to understand, how these budgets would, additionally change if we add to the socioeconomic objectives other objectives like related to climate and biodiversity. And what we are trying to do is precisely we are taking up our methodology of public expenditure in food and agriculture, and we are trying to build markers across that would help us filter, what are the expenditures that are really harming climate and what are the expenditures that are really helping to adapt to climate, for example, and what are the expenditures that are really in food and agriculture hurting biodiversity and otherwise. For biodiversity, talking about partnerships, we are trying to establish a regular dialogue with Biofin, for example, to exchange notes on how we can do this. But in addition to bringing markers to the public expenditure work of the FAO, we are extending the policy optimization modeling tool. What will this mean in practice? Well, it means in practice that we will be able to have reallocations of the budget, whereby we will not only optimize for socioeconomic objectives, but we will find compromises to additionally, pursue environmental objectives. Think about, for example, minimizing greenhouse gas emissions in food and agriculture, or maximizing biodiversity indicators related to target 18. And we will be able to work with the policymakers to think about how they want to prioritize this through the weights of the policy optimization modeling tool. This is essentially policy coherence at a country level, working with governments. I leave it here, and I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak in this event. Over to you, Bala.
Thank you. Thank you, Marco. Very, very sort of interesting presentation, and really had exhausted the time for the presentations. But we will have certainly a few questions which we will take from the participants. And I think, Marco, if I'm correct, there are two to you which are on the chat. One is asking, I think both of them are related to the model that you presented, how much it is going to be relevant for biodiversity related discussion. And the other one is whether this can be optimized and used for maximizing soil health.
Thank you, Bala. These are pretty interesting questions, and they are actually taking us to what we are doing now. We're trying to incorporate indicators related to land use, soils, and different, let's say, biodiversity-related indicators, making the mapping up with what we have, in the indicators related to target 18, for example. And what we want to build is actually a biodiversity indicator that we can maximize. It basically means that when we bring this up, we will have to expand our conversation with the government partners, right? Right now, we talk to ministries of finance, ministries of agriculture, and now ministries of health, but we have to talk to the environmental ministries.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Marco. So, colleagues, the floor is open. In case if you want to ask questions, please raise your hand. We will try and recognize you, but otherwise you can also use the chat function. We will definitely have about 5 minutes more for question and answer and an interactive session. The floor is open, colleagues. Any questions, comments, inputs? And Laura, you can help me in case if I miss any hand that has been raised. Okay, looks like there are no. Okay, Orlando. Over to you.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Thank you. Thanks for passing me the floor, and thanks for all the speakers. This was a really fascinating session. I was hesitating to raise my hand because the question is not very well formulated in my mind yet, but one thing that I was very interested in was the rest of the value chain a little bit, looking at this kind of more systemically. One thing that I've studied has been how agribusiness has also had a large role in keeping the cost of inputs low. This has helped in many cases in a number of ways, their market share, so on and so forth. So I was just wondering if there were any reflections on how agribusiness can reinforce these actions towards repurposing subsidies, or vice versa, what needs to be done so that further along in the food system, right, what needs to be done to make the best use of this repurposing of subsidies? And it's just a question to see if there's been any thought in this. So thank you.
Okay, I think that looks like an open question. Any of the panelists, any of the speakers can address it if you are ready. Svetlana, Marco,
Yeah,
Nicoletta?
well, for me, the value chain, Lourdes, is very important. You know, if you saw one of the objectives that we were pursuing in this demonstration of our FAO tool was to maximize agri-food GDP. So I was no longer talking about agricultural GDP, right? And it turns out that sometimes your budget, repurposing, will differ if you use agricultural GDP or agri-food GDP. Why would that be the case? Because sometimes when you promote some primary activities that are better linked with the value chain down the road, you achieve better results. Also in terms of poverty and so on and so forth. Now, the optimization is telling me, you know, where would be the better space to repurpose along the value chain. Now, how do you get there? That the model is not answering me that. That's why we have the stakeholders coming in, right? So that's what we have done in Africa. You know, we bring the stakeholders in the value chain, and they will come up with the knowledge that we need to understand what would be ways of, you know, enabling policy support throughout the value chain when you are only promoting the primary production. And these are the productive linkages that are created throughout the value chain. So you got to think about how do you address the bottlenecks all the way along the value chain for policy support to be successful, even if it's policy support only the primary sector of agriculture.
Thank you, Marco. Any other inputs? Otherwise, any other questions? I don't see any on the chat. Okay, looks like there are no further questions as of now. And as I mentioned, that we are about 5 minutes behind schedule in terms of when we started. So thanks a lot, colleagues. Thanks a lot, participants. A very, very interesting session, full of information, full of ideas, full of how different organizations are addressing the issue of repurposing. And of course, there's no way I'll be able to consolidate or sum up, but just a few take-home points from my side, listening to the presentations very carefully. The first element of it, ample demonstration that discussions related to repurposing need to consider the local and national situations. I think that's something which is going to be extremely important as we move forward. Two, in the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, countries currently are updating and setting the national targets that speak to the global biodiversity targets and the global biodiversity framework. And it is extremely critical that if we really want to address the target 18 at the national level, we can no longer not address repurposing subsidies. It is extremely important and it is critical. And we hope that as and when countries are beginning to set the national targets and related indicators, they will consider some of the elements that are a part of these presentations that we have had today. And the third element of it is to ensure that when we are looking at repurposing, we look at 3 or 4 enablers. The first one is to ensure that they speak to the poor and reduce any inequalities. 2, there is enough public acceptance of these repurposing elements of it. And also they actually are spread over time and not rushed and done in an incremental fashion. And lastly and importantly is also to demonstrate that the relevance of repurposing really delivers the results that are expected and anticipated. And then the presentations, especially the one from Marco, very clearly demonstrate some of those numbers, some of those approaches at the national level, which actually will speak to the different confusions or the different challenges countries have when they are discussing the issue of repurposing subsidies. So from my side, Hussein, for EMG, in terms of 2 take-home messages. One is as and when you are looking at the third dialogue, looking at country case studies or on-the-ground experiences, is to ensure that some of these messages are appropriately communicated so that we can build on whatever we actually heard during the first webinar and the second one as we are concluding just now. And secondly, is to ensure that when we are looking at some of these elements, the term policy coherence had come quite a few times, not just from the Jeff presentation, but also from others. So it is very important that we look at coherent approaches to some of these issues. And certainly it's going to be critical as and when the EMG's mandate is going to be fulfilled, not just in the context of subsidies discussion, but overall in the context of common approaches to deal with biodiversity, common approaches to deal with pollution and other elements of it. So with that, I hand over back to Hussein for any final words, and I would like to thank EMG and all the presenters for your time, interest, and all the participants for staying online for the 1.5 hours that we've spent here today. Over to you, Hussein. Hussein, you're muted.
Thank you, Bala. I didn't want to take more time because we are already exceeded the time of this webinar, but it was really full of a lot of thoughts and experience and expertise. So I'm very well also thankful to our audience and also to our panelists, as I said. We very much look forward to the third dialogue, and I would highly appreciate if our panelists could spare a few minutes after this. But of course, we would congratulate them and we would thank them definitely. But I wanted also to ask them if they could share with us a few lines of recommendations and thoughts for us to take it forward in terms of what needs to be done in terms of collaboration. We heard a lot about what it is needed to be done in terms of the whole of a society, whole of a governance and government sort of approach at the country level. But we also would like to know what we need to do from the UN system level to better support countries in taking these things more seriously and having a good level of policy support and guidance. And if there is any case studies or any country-specific cases where they can bring up to the third dialogue, please do share with us the contacts and the coordinates so that we can invite them to bring those case studies at the country level to the table for the third webinar. And as I said, we hope very much that we create a compendium of these experiences, this expertise, these tools that you have been developing, sort of bring them into one reference document that can be accessed by all users, at least as in terms of information sharing and knowledge sharing to countries, to all that are dealing with this topic. We very much look forward to the third dialogue, having all of you again with us, hopefully in November. I would like to thank Laura, who has really been supporting this process for a long time now, and a lot of back and forth in pulling together this panel. This has not been easy. Thanks a lot, Laura. And this hopefully has given you enough energy to prepare for the third one. So thanks a lot. All of the best to you, and thank you so much, and apologies again for exceeding the time of the webinar. Have a lovely continuation of the day and night. Bye-bye.
Thank you, colleagues. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye.